Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, Totality and Infinity. So section 3b, we're looking at exteriority in the face. And so this part is dealing with, or this part that we're looking at today is ethics and the face. And this is the first of two videos dealing with this chapter. So let's jump into it. Infinity and the face. Okay, so there is a lot of material here that we've already covered. Actually, in the very beginning of the book, Levinas really kind of broke through all of this material, introduced all of this material quite clearly, actually. So we're really just filling in some details, I think, basically, in this section, section 3. So there's a lot of revision, which I said that in the last video, but that's kind of not so bad, really. So yeah, let's jump into it. The other is absolute alterity. Okay, we knew that. But for Levinas, so this absolute alterity, we could think of this in terms of a negation, a force, a negating force, a force that repels me in some sense. It denies me. It's this unassailable force. So we can think of it in those terms, the way that Sartre does, right, with his highly conflict-based model of interactions with others. But for Levinas, this negation, this negating power, I guess, that the other has as absolute alterity, actually refers to an earlier positive relation. And that's what was kind of unique about Levinas, and I think something that's by and large missed by the main kind of strand of phenomenology. So this earlier positive relation is established through discourse. We've talked about that before. Language establishes that connection with the other, but we're not talking about a language that imparts information. So this has nothing to do with comprehension. It's not about understanding. And he reinforces the idea that any word that attempts to capture the other within a theme immediately fails. As soon as we try and reduce the other to a definition or to a concept, as soon as we try and place them in some kind of fixed idea, just by the fact that they are absolute alterity, they have already broken free of that definition. They've already escaped that box that I tried to put them in. The word that bears on the other as a theme seems to contain the other, but already it is said to the other who, as interlocutor, has quit the theme that encompassed him and upsurges inevitably behind that said. So that's just that idea. They're always more than whatever concepts or definitions or terms I try to capture them in. And he calls this ethical inviolability. So that's just an interesting term to keep in mind. Ethical inviolability. That's this idea that they are free from, they're beyond my grasp. They're beyond my attempts to reduce them to anything, to categorize them in any way. They're inviolable in that way. So the relation then, this positive relation established in discourse, it doesn't come from the I. It doesn't come from me, because the relation puts that I, which I am, into question. So it questions the I. And that means that it doesn't come from me, it comes from the other. And Levinas calls this the moral summons. So the moral summons is the way that the other puts the I, which I am, into question. It's by, again, not by doing anything in particular, but just by its very presence as this absolute alterity, this dimension, this realm in which doesn't refer to me, this dimension which escapes anything that I can say or do. Just by doing that, it questions me. It questions the totality of the world that I've set up, that I've established myself in, that I've built up around me, where everything refers to me, everything has a meaning in terms of my goals, my projects. Everything faces me. Suddenly this transcendent other descends and puts that calls that I into question. It calls that the world that I have set up around myself, it calls that into question. Not everything now is centered on me. And like I said, this is the moral summons. And he says that, well, the main idea here is that it's the idea of infinity being concretely produced in the form of a relation with the face. And I think that's how he defines this moral summons. The idea of infinity being concretely produced in the form of a relation with the face. So the infinite, that which I can never grasp, which I can never comprehend, is not just understood as some abstract intellectual idea, a concept. It's actually viscerally present to me. It manifests, the infinite manifests directly in front of me as the other, in the form of the face. And so that the face, actually it's worth looking at this now too, the idea of the face. It's I was thinking about this last night, is Levinas is talking about the actual face, the face of a human being, but he's talking about the face as not as a physical object, not as belonging to an organism. He's talking about the face as this, as that through which this transcendent other appears to me. So it is like an actual face. That's the point, that this is a direct, unmediated, face-to-face encounter, right? It is literally, he's talking about a face, but it's not the face of an organism. It's not the face of another being. It's the face of this transcendent other. It's a face which, it's the way that this transcendent other manifests as a presence in my reality, in my world. And so it's a way in which the infinite concretely manifests. And he goes on to talk about Kant, Heidegger, and Hegel, and compares this idea, the infinite in those philosophers versus his infinite. And the infinite in Kant and Heidegger is ideal. It's something that we never come face to face with. We never actually experience. It's unexperienceable, in fact. It lacks positive meaning for us in their philosophies. What is positive, what is experienceable, is finitude for them. For Kant, in the form of sensibility, that's what is experienceable. That's what's and that's finitude. That's the finite in relation to this abstract, ideal infinite. And the same with Heidegger. What's experienceable for Heidegger is the finitude of being for death. But the infinite is something we never experience, we never come face to face with. And for Hegel, the infinite does have positive meaning, but its positivity absorbs the finite. So it leaves us with kind of not a concrete experience anymore, because what's ultimately true, the absolute, is not an individual experience at all. It's not an individual concrete experience. It's everything. So although the infinite has positive meaning in Hegel, it absorbs the finite in such a way that we can't really have this concrete face-to-face encounter with it, because we're just sucked up into it. We just become a part of the infinite. So he's just separating his philosophy, showing how he's moving in a different direction from these other people. But that's the main idea in that first part, I think. The notion of infinity being concretely produced in the form of a relation with the face. And that takes us into the second part of the video today, ethics. Alright, so the face then resists possession. The face of the other resists possession, but not as an insurmountable resistance. Not as a force against which I just can't, not as a force which counters my force. Because if that was the case, then we'd be absorbed into a totality, right? If the other was just the same as me, just stronger. So if they resisted me just by being stronger than me, then we become two parts of a totality. We get reduced into the same. It doesn't resist me in this way. It's the resistance that it offers, that it has, is as an absolute transcendence. So it's a resistance it's like on a completely different order of being. It's a resistance which it's a non-resistance. It's a resistance that isn't a resistance. It doesn't have to. The other doesn't have to exert any force in order to resist me, in order to resist my attempting to circumscribe it with language, or to comprehend it or understand it. It doesn't have to fight with me. It just by being what it is, just in virtue of what it is, it is inviolable, right? But the face is vulnerable in one way, Levinas says: murder. So while I can't take the other, I can't take possession of the other, I can't reduce them to a definition, I can't encapsulate them in any kind of expression, I can't comprehend them or understand them, they don't fit into the world that I perceive around me, where everything fits into my projects and my goals. I can't take a hold of the other in this way, but I can kill it. That's interesting. So murder for Levinas is kind of takes on this extra kind of layer of significance that we might not have given it before. The grasp aims at possession, right? The grasp aims at possession, preserving something, preserving for me, so that I can use it, so that it can become instrumental to me in some way. That's what the grasp does. Killing, destroying, these kinds of actions, when we're considering things or even living beings, still belongs to labor. It's still a part of that economic mode of existence. So we're still, everything's still relating to me at that point. even though I'm destroying, even though I might be taking a life. And I guess maybe we're thinking of things like cows or pigs or something, chickens, but even that it doesn't rise to the level of murder, because we're still in the realm of labor. We're still dealing with a world which is centered on me, labor, economy, grasping, possession, all of that stuff. So it's all taking place at that level. But murder, however, doesn't possess. It doesn't aim to possess. It doesn't aim to grasp. All it does is exercise a power over what escapes power. And it's the only way we can exercise power over such a thing. And so he says, the other is the sole being I can wish to kill. Any other destruction, even the destruction of life, as long as it's not a transcendent other, another human being, it's always going to fit into a referential totality, something which is a system which is geared towards me, and it's going to be it will be for the goal of possession, of owning, of using. It'll have some kind of utilitarian, practical benefit to it. But the only type of destruction that doesn't fit into that economic mode of existence is murder, and that is the destruction of the other. And it doesn't fit into that mode, that economic mode of life, because there's no sense in which I'm trying to grasp or possess the other by killing him or her. There's no it's solely about it's a futile effort to exercise power over something that fundamentally escapes my power. So anyway, that's the significance of murder comes up there for Levinas. And just we might come back to that actually in a minute, but just moving on from there, the opposition of infinity with which the other opposes me then is what Levinas calls an ethical resistance. So this is kind of circling back to what I said at the beginning of the section. The face resists possession not as an insurmountable resistance, but as absolute transcendence. This resistance, this form of resistance, which I called like a non-resistance, is what Levinas is calling ethical resistance. So it's resisting not with a greater power, but just resisting by being what it is, a transcendent other. So in terms of the other, talking about the other, Levinas says he can oppose to the force that strikes him not a force of resistance, but the very unforeseeableness of his reaction. He thus opposes to me not a greater force, but precisely the infinity of his transcendence. There is here a relation not with a very great resistance, but with something absolutely other. The resistance of what has no resistance, the ethical resistance. So that's an interesting and a good concept to have in mind, ethical resistance. And it's probably worth mentioning here that this word ethical, I think I've said this before, ethical just really means concerning the other. It means concerning that relation with this absolute alterity that is the other. So it's not about right or wrong. That's kind of the important thing here. It's not good or bad, right or wrong. If anything, it's the ground on which right and wrong will emerge, from which right and wrong will emerge. So when Levinas says ethical here, ethical resistance, he's not invoking ideas of the right way to resist or resisting as kind of a good action. He's just saying this is resistance from the other, out of that relation with the transcendent other. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Ethical is not good and bad, right and wrong. It's just as pertains to our relation with the other. So okay, cool. They resist me with an ethical resistance, but they're vulnerable in one way to murder, which has nothing to do with kind of normal killing or destruction, which is an attempt to possess, so falls under that economic mode of existence. Nice. Now, the last part I want to mention before moving into the third part of today's video is expression. It's actually not. It's just the first word of what I've written next. So anyway, this manifestation of the other, which happens in discourse or expression, arouses desire. Remember, we talked about desire way back I think in the first video, as that as a capital D desire, as that metaphysical longing for that relation with the other. So anyway, that's what happens here. The manifestation of the other arouses this desire. To manifest oneself in attending one's own manifestation is to invoke the interlocutor and expose oneself to his response and his questioning. So when, now I think I've got this right. It just occurred to me that it could go the other way. I think this is right. To manifest oneself in attending one's own manifestation, that's the other. The other manifests themselves while being there, while being present. And that's what this whole relation with the other is about, manifesting while attending one's own manifestation. And that invokes the interlocutor, me, and exposes them, the other, to my response and to my questioning. So the other appears to me, the other manifests, becomes present to me through discourse, through expression, through the face. Okay, so that's that face-to-face encounter. But by doing that, there is that vulnerability. There is that sense of, and then that's what the word expose kind of brings to mind, right? Exposing oneself, exposing the other exposes him or herself to my response and my questioning. They are inviolable. They're forever beyond me, beyond my grasp, but for this one vulnerability of murder. So there is nevertheless an aspect of vulnerability to their manifestation. And when they appear in this way, when they manifest, the other manifest. I'll keep using that word. It's a little bit full of religious connotations, but Levinas uses it, so I'll keep using it as well. When the other manifests, that manifestation, that presence of the other, that sight of absolute alterity, that position, that absolute kind of fixed position beyond anything in my world, promotes my freedom. It's that which grounds my freedom. prior to that, I was this contingent. I thought I had freedom, but it was kind of contingent. It was arbitrary. There was nothing to check that freedom, so it wasn't really freedom at all. It was just arbitrary, kind of anything goes. So when the other appears, they ground freedom for me. Suddenly that I become free in the eyes of the other, through the manifestation of the other. So their expression promotes my freedom and arouses my goodness by imposing an order of responsibility. And that's the key word in this section, I think. Responsibility. So now I am, in having been made free and having been raised to this level of a non-contingent, non-arbitrary freedom, now I become responsible. I'm responsible for that freedom. And my first responsibility, I guess, is to the other who is now exposed, the other who is vulnerable to murder. So now that's where kind of the first layer, I guess, of my responsibility manifests is directly before the other. And he talks about the connection between expression and responsibility being the essence of language. So again, connecting language, expression, discourse, that's all what establishes that relation with the other. So once we have that idea that expression is bound up with this idea of creating this relation, then it's also bound up with the bestowing of freedom upon me, and in turn bound up with my responsibility, the idea that I have this ethical responsibility. And he calls it actually the ethical condition. The essence, the essence of language is the ethical condition. I think that's the way it goes. Or language is the ethical condition. But language is what makes that relation possible. And ultimately, when we follow that train of thought, we realize that it's what makes responsibility possible as well. So language is the ethical condition. And it's prior to the disclosure of being in general and knowledge. So again, we've said this before, ethics precedes ontology. And ontology will in fact be grounded in that ethical relation, that relation with the other. I think that's the key word there for that section, ethics. I think he calls it the ethical in the face. Ethics in the face, I think, is the name of the section. I just called it ethics in the video. But the key word, I think, is responsibility, which establishes this kind of, like an ethical demand, I guess, a demand that I act in such a way that I don't that I preserve or allow for the presence of the other, that I foster and maintain this relationship, this transcendental relationship. Okay, let's have a look at the last section, reason and signification. Okay, so starting with the reason. So we've got this is kind of the way I started every section, right? The presentation of the other manifests before us. And this manifestation, this presentation of the other is non-violent, non-resistance, but it initially appears to limit my freedom. So, and I talked about this at the end of the last video, the way that before the other, I feel myself to be free, completely free, right? Everything is directed towards me. Everything has meaning for me. Everything is, I am the one who bestows meaning. Everything gets its relevance through my projects and my desires. And I feel myself to be free, to have freedom. But when the other appears, my freedom now appears arbitrary, guilty, and timid. No, not my freedom. I now see myself as arbitrary, guilty, and timid. So that freedom that I thought I had now becomes, now that there is someone else, now that there's this other who escapes my freedom, who can have a different relation with things in the world to me, and thereby challenge what I have, the world that I have constructed, erected around myself. Now I see that my freedom is arbitrary. It's not the freedom that I thought it was, and I see that in fact my own life and that everything had relevance for me was wrong. Now I see that it was kind of too small-minded, if you like. There is this other who has a different relationship with things, and so they kind of just reveal to me that my world is not as big as I thought it was, or it's not as total as I thought it was. So at first they appear to limit my freedom in this way. They call me into question like this. But then, as we saw in the last section, this calls me to rise to responsibility. They invest me, the other invests me with freedom. And this kind of validates our existence. It gives justification to what I now realize in light of this relation with the other. I now realize was unjustified, was arbitrary. I thought it was total freedom, but it wasn't total freedom. It was freedom, but there was nothing to challenge that freedom. I thought it was absolute truth, but that was only because there was no point outside from which my word could be challenged. In fact, after the other has appeared, now I realize that what I thought my word in the past, the truth that I believed, was actually neither true nor false. It couldn't be, because there was no outside perspective. It was whatever I said went, which means it's arbitrary, it's unjustified. So the other, and Levinas actually calls that a brutal spontaneity. I quite like that word, that expression. So it was contingent, it was unjustified, empty, meaningless. And so that way of seeing things, that mode of existence, contingent, unjustified, is irrational then. That's where irrationality lies, in the same, in the I. In the sense that it was contingent, it was this brutal spontaneity, it was thereby irrational. And the relation with the other ends this brutal spontaneity. And in ending that kind of reign of unjustifiability, that arbitrariness, it founds reason. So reason can only come about through the other. And that's kind of the point of that long diatribe, is that reason is founded in the relation with the other. prior to the other, when it's just me, when everything has meaning and by reference to me, that is a contingent existence. In essence, there is no meaning in such a structure, because how could there be meaning without a kind of an external point? If everything is whatever I say it is, everything has meaning just in relation to my own projects and my own goals, there's no there's no sense in which meaning even exists. The same with truth and falsehood. There's no sense in which I can even talk about truth in such a setup, because there's no external point which can in which I can kind of reference myself. We need that external, absolute external location in order to provide meaning, in order to provide a source for meaning. It doesn't mean that I get meaning from the other. It doesn't mean that the other tells me what things mean. It doesn't mean that the other tells me how things should be, and I kind of submit to them. The idea is that without that reference point, nothing I do has meaning. The words true and false don't mean anything unless there is another who can call that into question. So that's why we need this external point, this relation with the other. And prior to that, it's so what we have is that contingent, irrational. It's an irrational existence prior to that, because again, how could it be rational? There's no yardstick by which we could measure reason. Everything is just for me. Everything has meaning for me. All roads lead to me. And in such a situation, reason doesn't mean anything. Rational has no meaning. That's the kind of the epitome of an irrational existence. So when the other arises, when the other presents before me, they give that point outside my world. That point that's absolutely outside my world, which I cannot control. And it's the existence of that point that allows for justification, justifies my existence. Now I can talk about meaning. Now I can talk about reason. Now my thoughts, my actions, my behaviors, none of it's not arbitrary anymore. Now that there is this kind of validating point, there is this true external perspective. And prior to that, there wasn't. I think I've belabored that point a little bit too much. But that's the idea. Reason can only be founded in the other. So the other part of this section is signification, or meaning. And so since the other founds reason, and the relation with the other is produced in language, then language conditions rational thought. And that's kind of an important statement, because it reverses common wisdom on this, right? Where we imagine that thought is first and language is just kind of a way of codifying thought. We're just tacking signs onto thoughts in order to convey, as a means of conveying our thoughts to other people. But Levinas is saying the opposite. Language conditions thought. Thought doesn't condition language. And he credits Merleau-Ponty with this as well, because This is a big part of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, especially in Prose of the World, which is an incompleted book that an incomplete book Merleau-Ponty started writing and never finished. But what's there is still definitely worth reading, and talks about this, the way that language is kind of originary in a sense in which we usually don't give it credit for. We usually, like I say, just think of it as kind of almost arbitrary signs that we just slap on to thoughts, and the only purpose of language is a transparent one, just to refer to the thought. So the sign is just a signifier, and it has no meaning in and of itself. Its only meaning is the thought that it signifies, that it points towards. But now that we have this kind of picture through Levinas, the other founding reason, and the relation with the other being produced in language, now we can see kind of a path around that, where it's language which is more instrumental here than we usually give it credit for. It's the originary act, not the rational thought. And another guy who talks about this quite a lot is, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Renaud Barbaras. He's French. I think he's French. He wrote a book called The Being of the Phenomenon, and he discusses Merleau-Ponty's visible and the invisible, and that's a really interesting read. And he also stresses this idea that thought is not, thought doesn't precede language. It already arises immersed in language. So again, the idea language is more foundational. Language is prior to thought. Language grounds thought in a very real way. But yeah, it's kind of, I'm straying from the topic a little bit, but language conditions rational thought. So it's worth just thinking about this a little bit to try and make sense of it, because at first it doesn't make sense, right? How can language condition thought? Don't you need thought in order to have language, in order to create language? Wouldn't thought have come first? Didn't people start thinking and then start attaching names to things? That's kind of the way we usually think. But this is absolutely reversing that idea. And the way that Levinas talks about it, he says signs don't produce meaning. Signs don't produce meaning. Rather, signification makes the sign function possible. And that's exactly the same thing as saying language conditions thought, not the other way around. So signs don't produce meaning. The sign doesn't direct us to something with meaning, i.e. the thought. Rather, signification, meaning, makes that sign function possible in the first place. Signification makes it possible for there to be a word that acts as a sign for a thought. So signification is prior, meaning is prior. The being of signification consists in putting into question in an ethical relation constitutive freedom itself. Meaning is the face of the other, and all recourse to words takes place already within the primordial face-to-face of language. Signification is infinity, that is, the other. Okay, so meaning is possible only through the other. That's kind of the summary of that. Meaning is possible only through the other. And again, it might seem backwards. It might seem to have this backwards, right? How can meaning be possible through the other? Usually, we have meaning first, and then we can codify it in words, and those words are signs that point to thoughts. So meaning is kind of derivative. It's something that comes about through signs, through language, and language is grounded in thought itself. The thought produces the language, which produces the meaning. But we're reversing that here. Meaning produces the language, which produces the thought. So if we've got this idea that I was trying to think of how this could, because it is such a strange notion, right? That we're going, how can meaning precede the signs? How can meaning precede the meaning of words, precede the words themselves? And how can all of this precede thought? But the idea, I think, is that, well, there are two things that I thought about here. The first is that language could never have developed without the other. So if there was just an isolated person, an isolated individual, no other people around, language would never have developed. Meaning would never have developed. And even thought would never have developed. What would you think? How would there be any, without that kind of drive for communication, what would you think? And again, it runs kind of a little bit contrary to how we imagine the world. We imagine the thought first. It's just so, it seems like such an inevitable conclusion that the thought must be there first. But if there was really no one else, if there were no other people, you were just this isolated individual, I don't think you would ever think anything. Thought wouldn't even occur to you. I mean, and that sounds crazy, but thought, there would just be no reason for it. You know, how could it arise? We tend to think that it would arise naturally anyway, if given enough time. But I don't think it would. I think it requires that interaction with another person. Communication. I think that's the drive that leads to thought. That need to communicate. I think that's where the drive for thought comes from. And that, because in order to communicate, you have to have language. So again, we're just completely reversing the normal way that we think about this. And this leads to the second point, which is that we aren't disembodied minds. We aren't disembodied thoughts that then need to find signs to refer to them. And that's a big hurdle to overcome. But it's the Cartesian mind. It's that Cartesian delusion, right? Everybody claims that they don't believe it. But if you think that thoughts precede language and precede meaning, then that is exactly what you're believing in. You're believing in a Cartesian mind. And I mean, I really think that the Cartesian mind is at the root of so much thought and philosophy and science. Anybody who talks about consciousness is almost invariably wrapped up in a Cartesian framework without realizing it. And it's the same here. We automatically think the mind comes first. But I think that's an illusion, and it's the Cartesian illusion, Cartesian delusion. So if we can get around that, if we can stop thinking of ourselves as little Cartesian minds first, then this idea that language precedes thought is not so radical. And this idea that signs don't produce meaning, but signification, meaning, is what makes the sign function possible in the first place. Then I think that becomes much easier to grasp, and it seems much more plausible. And so at this point we can circle back to reason, and the second look at reason, we saw before, reason is founded in the other, and reason then, because the other relationship with the other, the relation with the other is founded in discourse, then reason is founded in discourse, i.e. language. So reason then is not this universal, impersonal legality, Levinas calls it, which could absorb the plurality of the interlocutors. Reason is not this, and this is a resistance to Kant and Hegel, in which reason is this universal, this absolute that absorbs all of the concrete individuals, the particulars. But if Levinas is right, reason is founded in the other, the relation with the other is built on language, then reason comes about through language, comes about through this relation with the other, which means that it's concrete and it's particular. In fact, it means that it's ethical, right? It's ultimately grounded in the relation with the other, which makes it ethical. So the ethical precedes reason. We talked about it being preceding ontology earlier on. Now we're saying it precedes reason, grounds reason. And what is essentially saying the same thing is to say that society precedes reason, because society is this relation with the other, kind of writ large, expanded to relations with many others. But we're going to look at society in the next video in more detail. So I'm not sure if that has clarified this for you, and it's actually really clarified it for me. Even, I don't know if my ramblings kind of came out to anything useful for you, but it really, in some bizarre way, crystallized things quite totally for me. I'm just reading that barbarous book now, The Being of the Phenomenon, and as I was reading this section on signification and expression, I was just hanging on by a thread, kind of just like it wasn't clear to me exactly how language was going to be, or how it could be so important. But this has really helped. That idea that the other in founding reason, the other founds reason, and that the relation with the other is established through language, means that language and signification come first. So the other also found meaning, that instead of this kind of arbitrary existence where everything it refers to me, now that external point creates meaning. Now it's meaningful to use the word meaning. Now I can actually say meaning with and mean something, because prior to that the word didn't mean anything. Lots of meanings in that, but because it was just me, everything made sense within my own structure, within my own teleology, now that there's this absolute other perspective, this absolute external point, reference point, now what I do can have meaning for the first time. And so in founding meaning and founding signification, that's when now we have language and discourse arises at the same time in that relation with the other, and that is what makes rational thought, the reason, possible. Okay, cool. I better just stop talking, I think. Hopefully that has clarified something in some strange way for you. Let's have a look at a summary. So first we looked at infinity and the idea, we talked about Kant and Heidegger, for whom the infinite is not positively experienced. What's positive in those two was finitude. The finite was able to be directly experienced, was the only positivity there. Hegel saw that he gave us a positive view of the infinite, but in him the infinite absorbs the finite. So it meant that there's no direct contact of the individual with infinity, because the individual just gets sucked into infinity, at which point you can't experience it because you are it. Whereas for Levinas, the infinite is concretely produced in the relation with the face. And that's a nice point of distinction. Then we looked at ethics, and in here, the other, starting from that point, the other opposes me with an ethical resistance. So this resistance, this ethical resistance, it's kind of like resistance with no resistance. It's a resistance that doesn't counter my force with another force, which would reduce it to the same, would put me in a relation of totality with them. Rather, the resistance comes from that distance of the infinite. But this meant that the other was vulnerable or exposed, particularly to murder. So the other is the only being that I can kill. And this whole scenario imposes an order of responsibility on me. So now the other, through their investing of me with freedom, that created, or what came with that freedom, was responsibility. To use that freedom, how can we say, appropriately, wisely, to not abuse that freedom. I guess that's the best way to say it. Now we have this freedom, we have the responsibility to not abuse it, and that was, I think, the key idea from that little section on ethics. Finally, we looked at reason and signification. The other, in ending contingency, makes reason possible. So we talked about that brutal spontaneity of the economic mode of existence, where everything refers to me. That emergence of an external point, an absolute exteriority to me, an absolute transcendent point outside of my control, ends contingency, ends my arbitrary existence, and makes reason possible. And another key point there in that section, language conditions rational thought. So the other in founding reason, the other founds reason, and the relation with the other is produced in language. Therefore, language precedes and grounds rational thought. That is an important idea to get your head around, because it's the opposite of how we normally think of things. But it's kind of central to Levinas's whole project here. And finally, the last thing I want to say regarding this is that meaning is possible only through the other. And again, for the same reasons, that external point of reference absolutely outside of my control is the only thing that that means that meaning or signification can be meaningful. If that's not too many meanings for you in one go. Okay, I think when I start talking about meanings and meaning being meaningful, and I think that's the point where I should stop this video. So yeah, let me call it there. In the next video we'll look at the second half of this chapter. That's it for me. Thanks everyone. I'll see you next time.